So sadly did not start that recording to record all of those administrative comments and questions. So if you did not come to class and are starting to watch this now, hoping to hear some answers to questions about the final projects and reports and all that, just if you have any specific questions, please feel free to email me directly or post in the discussion on Canvas, so that not only can you get your answer, but other people can see answers to that as well. So now we'll just move on with the content. Like I said, I didn't want to spend too much time on the rest of this because I wanted to make sure people had an opportunity to ask any questions that have come up about the old content as sort of a review before the final exam. But I did want to at least kind of tie up any loose ends in this area. And so last time we introduced a specific type of interacting particle system called a cellular automata. And we specifically focused, after some two-dimensional CA examples, on the elementary cellular automata, or ECA, which was popularized. So cellular automata go way back. Yeah, you find I think von Neumann, Stanislav Ulam, are sort of the ones who are associated with thinking about CAs back in, I don't know, the 20s or 30s, 1920s or 1930s. And so, but in say the 80s, Stephen Wolfram, the Mathematica physicist, got involved and said, well, let's look at ECAs, these simplistic evolutionary, simplistic one-dimensional CAs. And even though they are so simple, there's a rich diversity in behaviors you can get from their rules, from these deterministic rules. And some of them have interesting properties and other ones have other types of interesting properties. And so we talked about how you should, that these CAs describe that if you have a infinite row of cells, then the question is, how do you get from one generation to the next? And so that will get you another row of cells. And so then and each one of these cells is going to either be a 1 or a 0. And so you can imagine that there are scenarios for the 3 parent cells above each child cell. Which determine the outcome. And so we know that there are, that each one of these parent cells can take either a 0 or a 1. And so there are 2 to the 3rd, or 8 different parent scenarios, which we can just number. And so these are, you could view these as, well, so these are, I mean, it's true that they are combinations, but the permutations matter here too. So so it's not just there are 2 1s, but there are 2 1s in this particular position. So that's what we get these 8 different 8 different particular scenarios that each have an output, which will be whether it's a 0 or 1 in the next generation. And so we can number those 0 through 8. So I can say there's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, I guess 0 through 7. And then if I were to then write those 8 scenarios in binary, then I get 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, Maybe I'll do it this way so I can change colors. Under there, okay. So maybe it's helpful if I draw some dividing marks here. So the cool thing here is if I number the 8 different scenarios and then I end up breaking them out into their binary expression, then what's super convenient about that is that the binary expression for each scenario number corresponds to the parents that are directly above it. And so I can say, oh, for the scenario 0, that's when all of the parents are zeros. Well, then you can say, well, for scenario 0, if all the parents are zeros, then I'm going to say that I have an output of, I could say that maybe this output will be 1, this output will be 0 when only the rightmost parent is a 1 and everybody else is a 0. This output will be 0 as well, and then this output will be a 1. And then maybe these are all zeros here. And so this now, we can say, well, this is a binary encoding of a number between 0 and 255. And so you can then turn those into the so-called ECA rules. And so here I can see that that this number here, well, if I think about this in binary, well, this is the this is the 1's digit, the 2, 4, and then what did I do wrong there? Right, so then this is 8, and so here I've got 8 plus 0 plus 0 plus 1 is equal to 9. So this, and then these are all zeros, so this here would be rule 9. And so you can go into Wolfram's book, or if you were to look at maybe the Wikipedia page on evolutionary cellular automata, and you can find all 255 rules, and what they know. So everybody now, people have studied rule 0, they've studied rule 1, they've studied rule 2, and they've grouped them into classes. And so some of these rules, so basically I think there's, I don't know, 3 classes of rules. And so these are like complexity classes. And so it basically is like the types of patterns that you can get out from these rules help us to then group them into how special these rules are. So rule 0 is just going to put zeros as, regardless of what the parent population is, the child is just going to be 0. So you end up getting the pattern of zeros all the way through. So that's not very exciting. So some of these rules produce interesting patterns and other ones do not. And so, we mentioned that there are certain rules like the traffic rule, which is, I think, rule, I always forget if it's 184 or 182. Let me go back and make sure. Well, I guess I could say, well, so rule 184, and it just happens to simulate, cars driving in traffic. mention that there's a majority rule, which is rule 232. And this is one if majority won in previous generation. And you can combine these two together to make a density classifier. And there's a bunch of other, oh, thanks. I should have just looked up at the chat. Thanks, Emily. Yes, rule 184, right, the traffic rule. And there's a bunch of other really interesting rules, like, for example, rule 30 is generates chaotic trajectories. And what I mean by chaotic trajectories is that it is highly sensitive to its initial conditions. And so you take an initial configuration at generation 0 and you flip one bit and you get a very different pattern that comes out of rule 30. And so there are pseudo-random number generators that are based on rule 30. And so the seed for your pseudo-random number generator ends up being your initial population. And then you can run the thing, and then you could do something like count the number of ones in the row. And that can be a number that then you divide by maybe the total possible ones, and you get a random number between 0 and 1. So you can use rule 30 to generate this, a pseudo-random number generator, to draw a number between 0 and 1 randomly. And there are some other, more artistic rules, like rule 90, can generate the Sierpinski triangle. So you seed it with a particular cell, and then it generates triangles that have this fractal pattern where you get triangles inside triangles. And so that's the kind of the, you triangles inside triangles, and then those triangles, and so on and so forth. Something like this. And you can imagine that there are some interesting degeneracies, like there are rules that are just the reverse of the other rules if you flip ones and zeros. And so you get the exact same patterns out if you take the perspective that what you used to call a 0 is a 1. And so so there are those types of rules. And so there's not actually 256 unique rules. So the people have categorized exactly how many rules are not just degenerate forms of other rules. And so people have done a lot of studying these things and the different patterns that come out of them. And a lot of attention has been given to rule 110 because it's been proved to be Turing complete. And all that means is that rule 110 is effectively this means that it's a general purpose evaluator of scripts that you can write in the initial condition. There's a question, degenerate form of other rules. What I mean by that is you can generate a rule that is based on thinking about ones, and then you can then generate another rule that's the same logic. Like, for example, the majority rule says that the offspring is a 1 if the parent generation is a majority of ones. And you can imagine flipping that logic a little bit and say, well, maybe the offspring is a 0 if the parent generation is a majority ones. So then you get very similar patterns out of technically a different rule, but these two rules' dynamics are nearly identical. And so there are a bunch of rules that if you just flip the logic so that you you flip all the zeros and ones, you can get a different set of rules. But or another way to view it is you could take this box here and you could literally flip all of the ones and zeros. So all this 1, 1, 1 becomes a 0, 0, 0, this 0, 0, 0 becomes a 1, 1, 1, and then this 1 becomes a 0, this 0 becomes a 1, and so on. And after you do all of that, then you could then say, what rule do I get out? And that rule would be effectively identical to Rule 9. It just would have its color inverted. So Rule 10 is Turing complete in that you can actually specify, you can encode any, I'll say, computable, I don't want to get too much into the jargon here, but any computable program as an initial configuration of cells. And that program, so then after, as that rule runs, then you can sort of watch in a distributed way. So Turing complete is named after Alan Turing. That's correct. So if you take, so this comes out of basic, theory of computation. So if you take a good course on on algorithms or computational theory, then you will learn all about Turing completeness. If you're interested in, I might also recommend reading Gödel, Escher, Bach, or the GEB. And so if you just search for GEB book computer science, you'll find the book. And so it kind of takes a more popular view of thinking about things in computation, like impossibility results, and whether it's possible to write a program that can determine if another program will terminate. And it turns out that that is not possible. And what does that relate to in other real life problems? And so, when I was a young student, the first time I encountered these things, it kind of blew my mind that there were problems that were beyond what you could possibly hope to ever solve, that they weren't just hard, they were not possible. And so some of you might be familiar with things about, if a barber only cuts the hair of people who don't cut their own hair, then who cuts the barber's hair? These paradoxes from Bertrand Russell and things like that all fall into this category. And so GED, Gödel, Escher, Bach, is a great kind of book that sort of brings all of these things together from, and you'll find out, I think, stuff that actually is related to more esoteric, maybe a little more boring things that you'd also see in a theory of computation class will show up there in with a little more pizzazz than you would if you took just like a course on this. But yeah, this Turing completeness has to do with whether the algorithm, so you have to define what a Turing tape is and all these sorts of things, and then what types of programs can be executed by this, all kind of outside the scope of this class. But basically, Rule 110, this simple rule, which is how cells interact with other cells, you can configure the cells so that the ensemble of cells, as they operate this rule, can execute any program. So any computation you want, right there. Figuring out this, it's difficult to figure out how to take your for loop and turn it into a set of cells. So I could say, as an example, convert a for loop into a set of cells, and then execute Rule 110 to determine, I'll say, outcome of for loop. So rather than writing your for loop in Python and then executing Python to see if what your for loop does, you can write your for loop and then convert it into this ugly encoding, which encodes all of the information about the for loop. And then you can actually kind of watch the for loop execute in this distributed way. Normally, when we think of a for loop executing, like you might think in terms of computer architecture, it could, ultimately getting computed into opcodes and machine code and things going into registers and shifting around. And that's the kind of very von Neumann architecture way of thinking about computing with a for loop. But in this case, you don't have an underlying hardware architecture that's keeping track of program line numbers and things like that. And yet, this ends up still being able to execute that. And I didn't. The name I used was von Neumann. So so von Neumann was a mathematician, famous for lots and lots of things, including advances in game theory, for example, but also in coming up with our modern perspective on the theory of computation. Largely was influenced by von Neumann, and there was a particular architecture that von Neumann came up with that would make computer programs more convenient to write, and it involved separating, so ergodic theory, the guy's all over the place. But in the von Neumann architecture, without, again, these sort of esoteric details that would be, we can go into much more detail in a different course, but basically you can imagine having memory, instructions, and other kind of computational hardware in separate spots. And so you could imagine your computational hardware goes out to a set of instructions somewhere, reads in what instruction it's supposed to currently be reading in on. It updates some program counter. That instruction tells it to go read from memory. That memory causes it to do a calculation. That calculation tells it how to update the program counter, which tells it where to go to its instructions, and so on and so forth. And so you've got everything divided out in a von Neumann architecture in a very convenient way that allows us to build computer programs. But obviously the brain, well, we not necessarily obviously, but the brain is probably not organized in this particular way. So there is a lot of interest in so-called non-von Neumann architectures, where the computing, where the instructions and the memory and all the mechanism for computing are all mixed up together, like you might imagine is going on in the wet mass on top of your head. So you don't necessarily have a spot that's just doing, that's a modular area where is just storing your long-term memory, and a smaller area that's your short-term memory, and another area that's all the instructions. We don't really know what instructions would even look like in the terms of a brain. It's hard to even see what instructions look like in the terms of a neural network, except for maybe the things operating outside the neural network, pushing the neural network around. And so so this is kind of the idea here, is that maybe there is a way that we do not need such a compartmentalized organization of our computing hardware that von Neumann asserted as a convenience to make computers start going. And so this Rule 110 is meant to sort of start demonstrating one way in which you could have a non-von Neumann architecture. Somehow Rule 110 is all of your program instructions are encoded in the initial condition. And yet but there's no extra memory. The memory is also in the state of the cells. So the cells that are storing the instructions are simultaneously storing the memory needed to execute those instructions. And so all of this stuff is all jumbled up together, and yet it's able to compute the same things that you otherwise would need a von Neumann architecture to compute. So there's been, again, a lot of focus on Rule 110 as being special because of this Turing completeness. And if you think about a deterministic CA, so just as a reminder, you just have a cell in the previous generation, a cell in the previous generation, another cell in the previous generation, and those three cells come together in some aggregation in order to determine the state of a cell in the next generation. And so this really is just, you could implement this with an artificial neural network. Where you could imagine that the neuron at this location, the neuron here, this is at time k, and this is at time k plus 1, and the activation function, so I'll say AF, activation function, for the neuron for time step k plus 1 is just aggregating inputs from two other neurons and itself at the previous time k. And so you could implement all the rules of a cellular automata in an artificial neural network. This implies that any special feature of Rule 110 could be implemented in neural networks. And so if we say Rule 110 is Turing complete, and thus cellular automata are Turing complete, then that sort of suggests that depending on how what is the neural network, or if you include the thing that's executing the neural networks themselves also are Turing complete. So there are topologies of neural networks that you could wire up and then initialize all of the neurons in the same way you initialize a cellular automaton, and then let the neural network compute and then settle out, and the neural network's output will be the output of your for loop. So neural networks can also be Turing complete. So that's what we kind of covered last time, these CAs. And what I wanted to add to that, are there any questions about that before I add a couple of minor expansions outside of the elementary CAs? Okay. So a natural generalization from ECAs are so-called stochastic or probabilistic CAs. And I would argue that a stochastic CA is a CA modeling something in the real world that we are abstracting the description of the evolution of the thing in the real world by saying that we just assume it's random. And a probabilistic CA is not a modeling anything, it's just a program that we have decided to run. So when it's a model, it's a stochastic CA. When it's not a model, it's a probabilistic CA. But mechanistically, they're the same. And so a stochastic cellular automata, if I stick to, for simplicity, the 1D case, or the 1D, I'll say ECA case, then what we can do is, instead of saying there's a deterministic probability that whenever you're in this scenario, you get exactly this offspring, you can now make the offspring a probability. So you could say that if I were to draw my little Tetris blocks here, then these are my 8 parent generation scenarios. And so these are each 0 or 1. And then this here is the probability of a 1 given the parent generation. So this, is of course between 0 and 1, or between 0 and 100%. So, so the idea here is that you now can have some stochasticity where things don't always have to show up. If you have a 1, 1, 1, you can say 90% of the time I get a 1, but 10% of the time I get a 0. And that creates a just slightly richer set of phenomena. And so as an example of that, and you might think this is just going to create, well, let's do this. I'm going to share my other screen here. So share. This one. And actually, maybe to make it clearer, let me share the window instead, if I can. I think I can. All right, so I think I can, let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit. So if I go, just open up NetLogo again, and now I'm using a stochastic CA instead. And so we can see here that in this stochastic CA, then rather than having rules that are specified by ones and zeros, then I have down here, if you can see my mouse, hopefully you can see things fluttering across here. This rule, you've got the parents listed here, 111, and then we don't have a nice convenient way to call this rule 50, because now we don't have the outputs are not bits, they're not just zeros or ones, but we can see that this rule has got 50% assigned to certain input scenarios and 0% assigned to others. And so if I set a random initial condition and hit go, I get something that looks, so if I were to say increase these to 100%, then I get things that are going to look like a normal deterministic. So this right here is your standard ECA. So, and so we get these cool triangles that form here. And so if, by changing those 100% to 50%, then I still see hints of those triangles, but they die out. So I don't get the persistent thing. So I get this weird percolating looking thing going on instead. And so that might be what you expect, just a bunch of hairy edges around a deterministic as the example of the, as what you'd get out of all of these probabilistic or stochastic CAs. But it turns out that there are some examples, like example 2 here, that they've kind of conveniently set up for me, that if I set up random initial conditions and hit go, I get things that come out of it that actually look, I mean, they're interesting patterns that don't obviously look fuzzy. This kind of looks like the folds of a brain or something like that. And so this comes from this CA here that has 50% on some of these, 100% on others, and 0% on others. And so these 50% here are enough to kind of generate, so it's almost like there's enough determinism to give you these regular patterns, but there are, whenever you get certain conditions, there's enough randomness to generate just a little bit of a bend in the patterns, which then ends up generating some of these edges here. So it's like you're flipping from vertical to horizontal, and then sometimes you flip from horizontal back to vertical. And that's kind of what's going on here. So you get some interesting new patterns out of the stochastic CAs than you would out of a purely deterministic CA. So more and more richness as you add to these rules. You could go to 2 dimensions as well. And so you can have 2-dimensional stochastic CAs, even more richness. And so using that as motivation, the kind of CA topic that, oh, and yeah, the last thing I want to mention here, so I've got that up there. I'm going to flip back to the notes. So go here and share. And I may have to stop sharing here and then restart the sharing here. All right. So, so these stochastic CAs, I posted an article recently that that actually, so if you go back and think about simulated annealing, if you remember, simulated annealing was simulating this process where you've got a hot material that has got atoms within lattices or molecules that are jittering with certain thermal agitation, and they're moving into different states. And so they're one popular low-level model for thinking about these, what's going on underneath a material as it's moving through this thermal agitation, is something called an Ising model. And I won't go into all the details of what an Ising model is, but an Ising model is an is an IPS. So this is one of these interacting particle systems. So there are cells on a lattice that influence each other. And in an Ising model, it's modeling the evolution of magnetic domains in a material. And so you know that, like, if you have a magnet, it's magnetic because all of these internal domains are aligned in the same direction. So none of those magnetic fields cancel out, and you get a net magnetic field that is a strong magnetic field outside of the object. And so you can use an annealing process to generate these magnets. And so you basically can take something that is ferromagnetic but doesn't have a magnetic field, you can heat it up, and then you can subject it to a magnetic field that maybe you generate electrically, and then cool it down very, very slowly. And as you cool it down slowly, all of those domains will will become aligned because you've heated them up. They become aligned with the external field. And as you cool them down slowly, they stay aligned. And then you can turn off the external field, and the aligned domains will stay aligned, and then they'll generate their own magnetic field. So this is the way you can build a bar magnet, for example. And so an Ising model helps to explain some of those dynamics. And so an Ising model has got these spins which are up or down. And so you can think of them as like ones or zeros in a cellular automata. And so ones, you can, if you'd like, if it's easier to think of this as north or south, that's fine. It's not quite right to think of it that way, because it's like a magnetic dipole, and it's like whether the bar magnet is in one direction or another. And so so you can think of each one of these as being little magnets, either up or down. So there's these spins that are either up or down. And there are more certain configurations that are more energetically favorable than others. And that is how the annealing process works in making a bar magnet, is you subject it to a field that has an external field so that it is energetically favorable for everyone to be aligned in that field. But when the bar magnet is cold, or when the thing you're trying to make into a bar magnet is cold, it has no way to get over the energetic barrier to get into that favorable. So in our simulated annealing case, it's like, this is the case that this is just like a hunk of iron, and then this down here is the bar magnet. And so there is an energetic barrier. And so in annealing, you give it enough heat to get over that barrier. And then if you cool it down, it will stay in this lower energetic state, where with all the domains aligned to the external field, and then eventually you get a bar magnet out. And so real annealing helps generate these bar magnets. So not surprisingly, maybe, you can generate and take an Ising model and use an Ising model to build annealing inspired metaheuristics that are actually implemented in an Ising model. So it's kind of like you have to figure out a way to encode your problem the same way we encode a problem in a genotype for a genetic algorithm. You can encode your problem in a way that that ends up being solvable with an Ising model, and use the same dynamics that go on in the making of a bar magnet in this kind of simulated annealing that is actually happening on the level of a simulated magnet, of a simulated Ising model. The reason I'm bringing this up is that, again, the Ising model is one of these particle systems, one of these interacting particle systems. And even more, it is just a stochastic cellular automata. So whether in the next generation you're spin up or spin down depends on the spins of all of those around you and on whatever external field is applied. That's the Ising model. And so what people have done, as I posted in a couple of places on Canvas, is that now there are hardware implementations of simulated Ising models that are meant to provide hardware that is special purpose hardware just for doing super high speed simulated annealing. And underneath it all, they've built the hardware just to do a stochastic CA. So it's a decentralized framework that is just implementing an Ising model, but because an Ising model, and then they aren't physically heated or cooled, the hardware is heated or cooled in the same way that a parameter is heated or cooled. So, you know, in physics, you know, we have true temperature, but in simulated annealing, we have that parameter that is like a fake temperature. And there is a way to broadcast to the hardware what the current temperature is. And that changes the probability of whether they stay in the upstate or the downstate. And then you can have it cool by broadcasting what the temperature changes to. And then you can actually simulate, take simulated annealing, not written in computer code, but simulated annealing implemented on an ASIC. So on a hardware implementation of simulated annealing. And it makes for super, super, super fast combinatorial optimization. And so as the article mentions that I've put on Canvas in the simulated annealing section, as well as this section, you can read about it. It's a relatively new article, is that, that they are now marketing this for if you want to do like, you know, rapid traveling salesman problems, you know, these combinatorial optimization problems, you don't need to send it off to the cloud and have the cloud do, you know, a simplex method or whatever to solve your problem. You can actually just have local hardware that is using one of these hardware implemented stochastic CAs as just running a stochastic annealing algorithm, because we know stochastic annealing works really well, and we know the hardware does rapid lightning fast simulated annealing. So that is another option for doing these sorts of things. And so that starts to bring stochastic CAs. I'm starting to try to close the loop back on the course. And so I've gone a little bit far, you know, I've gone to the simulated annealing, but I did want to, my last, you know, comment on this tries to bring us back to our very first lecture on genetic algorithms and how the CAs relate to evolutionary algorithms. But before I get there, are there questions about this example, about how simulated annealing and the Ising model brings an implementation of simulated annealing that works in stochastic CAs? Is there, or just any questions about this in general, or about stochastic CAs? All right. All right, so like my closing then comment on, oh, so it's a probability based thing. Yes, exactly. You can view the Ising model as providing you, so you could say the next spin is like you could view this as the probability of switch spin given spins of others. And so if the spin is viewed as either a 0 or a 1 or an up and a down, and the spins of others are a 0 and a 1, you know, however many others, then you end up being able to turn an Ising model into a stochastic CA. And so you have to define, you know, the connectivity of the stochastic CA, exactly who are the others that each cell cares about. And then you have to decide these probabilities. But in an Ising model, basically this probability, there's an easy way to map a temperature to this probability. And in effect, what does is as the temperature goes to infinity, then the probability becomes, it's a 50-50 shot. You lose all connection to your neighbors. when the temperature is hot enough. And so everybody just becomes random. When the temperature is cold enough, then you never switch. You just, whatever your initial condition is, then you just keep with that. But once you're at a critical temperature, then these magnetic domains form, where you get large groups that share the same spin next to other large groups that share a different spin. And so when you physically implement one of these Ising models, you can do this in Excel, for example. You can have each cell in Excel take a 0 or a 1 and generate a temperature, and then have it iterate over that, or do it, you know, Python or MATLAB or whatever. And what you can see is, as you increase the temperature and then decrease it again, then you'll end up seeing a bunch of 0s and 1s that'll be random, and then they'll end up forming groups of 1s and groups of 0s, and then they'll kind of get stuck, and so on and so forth. And then I see another question here is, can the specialized hard work be used with other types of hardware, such as neural networks? If you, for example, wanted to use simulated annealing to optimize your neural network weights, then you could imagine these hardwares allowing you to do, you know, rapid training of your neural network in the field. So, so that would be one way that you could do that. So, or, you know, maybe there's another way you can view your neural network weights encoded into simulated annealing. Yeah, absolutely. If you can make it work with simulated annealing, you can make it work with these hardwares, because these hardwares are basically just an implementation of SA. An Ising-based implementation of SA. Okay. Great. All right. So my last comment of the technical content for the class, then, just to bring things totally full circle, is decentralized cellular evolutionary automata, or CEA. I'm sorry, I said automata, I meant algorithms, not automata, but I apologize for that. That's not an eraser. Algorithms. And I won't go into too much here, but the basic idea here is that if you think about it, our standard GA is panmictic, which means every individual can, you know, mate with every other individual. And then when we went to MOGA, multi-objective, and multimodal, then we started doing some kind of clever things that restricted gene flow. So then we had sort of more restricted gene flow, niches, you know, so there were ways in which only certain individuals would mate with other individuals. It was less likely for individuals to interact under certain circumstances. So if you were in the same niche, you know, it might mean certain things. You're in different ones, it might mean other things. So we started to constrain that. So a CEA goes even farther than that, and it starts to think much more spatially about these evolutionary algorithms. And so we end up, basically, we can say, you know, what if our selection pressure takes shape as an, for example, evolution or an elementary CA. And what I mean by that is, let's say you could create a line of individuals. And, you know, these individuals, I'm going to just make this a little bit bigger. So this is individual that has some genotype. This is genotype A. This is genotype B. And this is genotype C. And then I've got other individuals to the left and right. And so the question then becomes, what offspring goes in genotype B's position in the next generation? And so we can kind of use the patterning from cellular automata to tell us how to define our selection operator. So we could say, we're going to do a tournament selection among the 3 parents directly above the offspring cell. So maybe we want to do, as an example, tournament selection among 3 parents above offspring. And so it's this idea that you start deciding how to, so it's like you run little genetic algorithms where the individuals involved in your little genetic algorithms come from neighborhoods that are defined spatially along this cellular automaton. So that's what I mean by cellular evolutionary algorithms, is that we really take seriously where each individual is in space. And then based on their location in space, that is how we end up unrolling the algorithm. Now there will be interactions. So even in this one-dimensional case, then we know that genotype C is going to participate as the left parent in another neighborhood that is farther over. It will be the middle parent in another in the offspring that's directly beneath it. So we run the same GA rules, but our little populations change, but then our subpopulations interact. And so these cellular evolutionary algorithms provide us even more, I would say, degrees of freedom to play with as we want to tune, say, selection pressure. So how do we want to maintain diversity? This gives us a lot of opportunity to maintain diversity because there is less chance for an individual to take over a population because it needs to physically move across space in order to take over a population. But if an individual is really, really high in fitness, then it will eventually get through all that population, but it's harder for it to get through that population. So it provides just one more way to adjust selection pressure and maybe even create interesting patterns like speciation. So maybe you end up getting a group that is one particular strategy dominates, and then some intermediate strategy, and then another group where another one dominates. If you had a multi-objective cellular evolutionary algorithm, then you get even more exciting because then you really could create barriers where you get a niche in the upper left and another niche in between and another niche on the other side. And fitness, because the fitness is like the Pareto ranking, then all of them might have the same Pareto ranking, and so they can't get through each other. So they end up being boundaries to prevent migration, and you can physically see them in your EA space as these physical niches. So it's a way to kind of combine all these things together. So as a question, so it promotes exploration more, and exploitation is more at a group level rather than being at the entire space level. I think that is one way to kind of view, by enforcing these spatial constraints, that's kind of what you're doing. Is it's similar to how in our distributed genetic algorithms, where we created tiny little populations that had rare migration between those populations, and so with this kind of shifting balance theory, each population was a little experiment that ran independently, only trading its results after several runs. You can kind of think of it that way, but as an alternative framework for thinking about setting up these self-organized experiments. The cellular evolutionary algorithm. All right, now there's a lot more that I could say about CAs, about interacting particle systems, about these kind of multi-agent systems in general, but I kind of want to stop there. I want to make sure to see if there's any other questions that have come up, and just hopefully tie that off with a bow and sort of say that, you know, on the final exam, I might ask a question or two from this unit, but they're going to be very high level. They're not going to be sort of these kind of details just because it's the freshest content. So any questions or any last remarks? This might be the last time I see you before the summer. Yeah, I hope this has been a useful class for you guys. I know that it doesn't go into as much depth as you get in a lot of your other grad level classes. It was really meant to be a survey. I would bump into grad students that would not be familiar with some of these things or might have only heard about them, you know, rarely. And so I thought, well, it might be nice just to have an exposure course that brings all of these things together. And and as you can see on the Canvas site, all of these papers that I post, a lot of them are really old. There's been a lot of other work there, but there's a lot of resources out there. So my hope is just if you know the keywords, if you're interested in any of this stuff, you can find more info. And if not, send me a note and I can help hook you up with much more recent results in these. There's a question, are all lectures included in the final? The final exam goes over all the units. What I would recommend doing is at the top of every unit on Canvas, I've created a Canvas page called like Unit 1 Learning Outcomes, Unit 2 Learning Outcomes. Scan through those. Those are the things that I want a student to leave the class with. If you feel like out of every unit you covered all that, then you're probably going to be good for the final exam. The final exam is comprehensive, but it's going to be modeled largely after the concept check homework assignments. So those should be great prep, and then looking through those learning outcomes will be another, you know, good prep. Just think of the lectures as if you need more details to help buff up those learning outcomes, go find a lecture. But I'm not going to ask for, you know, really specific tiny details about, I mean, I don't know, we didn't go into a whole lot of tiny details, but again, I want you to come out of it like being able to demonstrate that you know the difference between a canonical genetic algorithm and a multi-objective genetic algorithm. You know what Pareto ranking is. You can understand a recurrent neural network versus just a feed-forward neural network. You have some familiarity to Hebbian learning. Those are all kind of useful things that would be, you know, hopefully useful as you move on, and that's what I'll probably test you over. Great, great. So any other, we've got about 2 minutes left in regulation here. I'm just scrolling through. All right, I don't see anything else specific. Again, there is that course evaluation out there. Highly encourage you to do that. That's great. For me, the feedback is helpful for me as I evolve this course. And it's also great for we're all experimenting with different ways to do things this semester. And so I think it's really going to be helpful for different faculty to see how students responded to these things, so that if we have to do this in the fall, we'll kind of have templates for what are some good models and some bad models. And so that's also very helpful. Oh, if it talks about labs and the evaluation, those are just stock questions that engineering dean's office puts in there. You can put, you know, an NA or because we didn't have a lab in this, or you can view your final project and that first homework as a lab. But no, this course does not have a lab. Yeah, and the muddiest points. Oh, I did want to mention that real quick. So I do leave comments for you in your muddiest points, and some of you respond to those comments, and I feel really bad because I get a notification on my phone that someone has responded to the comment. And if I tap on it, Canvas doesn't take me to that. And if I didn't happen to memorize who left, you know, who left that response and what assignment it was for, then that notification is gone. So on the instructor side, Canvas does not provide me a way to review your notifications that you've left me comments on my comments on your submission. So if you did have any responses to the comments I've left you on muddiest points or assignments, it's best to just reach out to me directly. I would only leave comments on assignments if those assignments are to be graded and your comments are supposed to help in grading. If they're responses to grading, just contact me directly. All right, anything else? All right, so as usual, what I'm going to do is I'll let you guys go. It's 4:20. It's the end of regulation. If anybody does have anything that they want to talk about, I can hang out here till 4:30, and then I'll close the room. So if you'd like to leave, feel free to take off now, and I'll either close the room when there's no other questions, or if it's 4:30. And otherwise, if I don't talk to you, have a good summer. Stay safe. Thanks. You too. Thanks. Glad to help. Glad to hear it. Thank you very much. Thanks for all that feedback. Appreciate it. All right. So looks like everything is rounded out here. So guess I am going to stop the recording